Hi, this is Michael Waits, and welcome back to This Month Amplified, January 2025. We are joined, as always, by David Gritz, a co-founder and managing director of InsurTech New York. David, happy New Year. How are you doing so far in 2025?
I'm doing great, Michael. Good to be back with you in the new year. You know, lots of energy and excitement every time you can start a new year with a fresh page.
Yeah, I feel great already. Look, let's talk about the fires in LA. The news we've been getting over here has made everything look really horrendous. But again, I never know what to trust. Where do you want to start on this conversation?
So I want to start with a little background on California, because not everyone listening is a Californian and doesn't have, intimate knowledge. So California is one of the largest states in the US, and it's the longest state from north to south. Just to give perspective, there's a highway along the coast, Highway 1 or Pacific Coast Highway. If you were to drive from, the kind of major southern city, San Diego, to, all the way up to Oregon, the next state north, it would take more than 10 and a half hours. And this is, driving on a highway at highway speed. So it's a very long state. So when you talk about Southern California, you're really talking about three specific metro areas. So the Los Angeles metro area, Orange County, which is kind of like main population center around Irvine, California, and then San Diego. So each one has kind of its own distinct characteristics, but within Los Angeles, it's on the coast. So you definitely have a lot of beach towns, like Manhattan Beach is, one of
Malibu.
them, or Malibu, a pretty famous beach would be like Venice Beach or Muscle Beach. And then, you go inland a bit and, it starts to get more densely populated. You have commercial districts. That's where the stadiums are. And then you continue east, and essentially on there's a ridge or kind of a mountain line. There's a mountain called Mount Baldy, and that mountain range is heavily populated with green forests, which fortunately I had the opportunity in hiking, and it's great obviously when there's not fires. So given that kind of geographic perspective, I would say one other thing to layer over that is, in the LA metro area, it's one of the largest population centers in the US. There's more than 25 million people that, live in and around that area, but is different than New York or Chicago or even Boston in the sense that it is a very sprawling and spread out city. So, you can live in LA and you can have an acre of land. I mean, you have to be pretty wealthy to have an acre of land, but there are people that do have an acre of land. It's not, a high-rise condo like Manhattan. So given, that kind of people overlay, the last overlay is essentially the context of the state of California. So, compared to the rest of the US, California has been, populated relatively recently. Like, most of it has been after 1850. And, it's partially because it's a semi-arid region, right? So you can get months, if not several months in a row without almost any rain. So they do, have droughts, and that's what contributes to some of the conditions that allow for wildfires. And it's not that wildfires are a human-made thing. They've been around since the last several hundred years in the history of California. Wildfires happen naturally. It's, part of Mother Nature's process of cleaning forests and the debris at the bottom. And, there's pretty much always been wildfires in the state of California, not just Southern California, but, all over the state. So now you overlay all these different layers. The last thing to know is, within, this area, oftentimes there's different wind systems. The Santa Ana winds is one of those that you'll, see a lot on the news. And these are, very fast-paced gusty winds that get up to 100 miles per hour. So that's essentially the conditions that you have there. And, what more or less happened is that it was a drought, or essentially dry for a very long period of time. And those conditions, create the ability for things to be more easily combustible. The Santa Ana winds, picked up some existing fires that were in the area and they spread them. And essentially that wildfire spread to some of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Los Angeles, neighborhoods that have, $10 million plus homes in Pacific Palisades. And when you say LA wildfires, it's actually not one wildfire, but there were at least 4 major ones happening simultaneously in different areas.
So there's a lot to unpack here, David. And again, I'm not asking you like it's your fault, but I'm asking you because you're smart. If there's been a long period of time without rain, right? So it's a naturally arid area, right? There are deserts in California. There are deserts in and around California. If we know that wildfires happen naturally, and if we know that the wind patterns can get weird sometimes, look, I'm just thinking back to a conversation I had with Ivan O'Neill back in June of 2023, who runs an InsurTech called Woo-Wee. It's all about like building resilience into communities so things like this don't happen. Like, there's no fault here per se, but like, what can be done so that things like this don't happen at this same scale? Clearly, you can't control the wind, but you can control some of the resilience. And I guess the second question for me is, because this happened in some very expensive neighborhoods, rich people are going to get really mad, right? Do you think that's actually going to be good for the outcome of this? Because when poor people get mad, nobody really cares. Like, that's just a fact, whether we like it or not. But when rich people get mad, people start to listen, yeah?
Well, let me parse out those 2 questions. So, first question is, what can we do?
Yeah, I always do that to you. Sorry. I should just ask one question at a time, but they're both in my head at the same time. So go ahead.
No, it's cool. I'll remember. So, first is building resilience, and then, we'll talk about kind of the economic divide. So in terms of building resilience, what we can do, and this is something that, Ivan taught me, is that there is a wildfire preparedness standard that a standards organization called IBHS created. It's, a series of things that you don't do one of them, you do all of them. And if you do all of them, then your home is prepared for wildfire. But, rolling back a tiny bit is, I think it's important to understand the mechanics of how fire spreads. Most people in their minds have this, illustration from childhood that a wildfire spreads in a forest, like one tree, and then it, touches the next tree, and then now the whole forest is on fire. And, there are fires that, spread in that way. But, if you go back to physics or thermodynamics, you have to remember that heat transfer happens in multiple different ways, right? So you can think of, your home or your stove as some of those ways. So first is, if you're lucky enough to have an old home, you might have, a boiler that heats up hot water, and that hot water then radiates heat into the room. So that's radiant heat, right? And then, there's also convective heat. So you think your stovetop, you put a pan on it, it heats the stove, and then the pan warms up because of contact. So, that tree example, we're thinking a lot of convective heat, but radiant heat is also, another form. And, there are, other forms of heat, if you think about how your microwave works or how radiation works, those are other forms of heat transfer. But I think just using those 2 simple examples, right? What happens in a wildfire is oftentimes it's not necessarily, the building to building to building convective heat, but it's essentially the embers spark into the air and they kind of float around, and then they land on different surfaces, which essentially can ignite those new surfaces. So if those new surfaces are, flammable roofs or siding of homes, then essentially you might be a mile or 2 out from the initial ignition point, and now you have new fires burning in a lot of different places. So what that means from a preparedness standpoint is that you can't just protect like a house next to a house, but you have to think about multiple different layers. So first layer is building construction and building codes. How can we have roofs that, will not become ignition points? How can we have siding that has, higher burn points or, won't burn? Like if you think about, cinder block, brick, or stucco, in some areas it might not be as beautiful, but it has different characteristics for heat transfer than siding that's made out of wood or siding that's made out of plastic. So if you think about that, ultimately you want to have siding and roofing that ultimately will not burn. And then beyond that is the defensible space. So the area around the home, if you have a yard with a lot of shrubs that essentially become combustible material really quickly, that's not as good as versus you have, fire resistant trees, shrubs, or plants at your home. And one of the things that Ivan taught me, he used their software on my in-laws' house, my brother's wife's parents that lived in San Jose, is they had a vine that connected a bush on the ground to the roof. And he said, this is one of the worst things that you can have, because you're literally connecting one surface to another surface. And once the roof's on fire, like you're pretty much out of luck with your house.
You're done. Yeah.
So essentially, some of these things are very simple, like just improving landscaping. Other things could be tremendously expensive. Replacing a roof, especially these days, is expensive. Hardening or improving siding is expensive. But if you think about it this way, would you rather pay $1 million to replace a roof and siding on a $10 million house, or lose the whole house? So you would probably prefer to pay for hardening. So to go to your second question, or the lead into your second question, are rich people going to be very upset? Yeah, absolutely. They're going to be very upset because, they don't like having their stuff destroyed. That's why, they pay for security, and, they probably might have, the proper insurances, but, they generally try and take good care of their assets. And, it's going to, I think, get a lot of people to think about, the choices they make. And, I've had a personal experience with this that really helped me understand the choices that people make. So, I have a friend, he's a commercial mortgage broker, and he lives in the Brentwood neighborhood of LA, which is, a relatively fancy neighborhood. There's definitely, movie stars that live there. But, he's a pretty successful entrepreneur. And, I remember this was a fire that was near the Getty Museum probably 5 years ago or so. It might be plus or minus a year. And, the fire was near the Getty Museum. They were very worried that the Getty Museum would burn. And, it went across the 101 and, basically went into his neighborhood. And I was there 6 weeks after the fire happened. And, I stayed at his house. He has like a, little Airbnb in his basement. His office is also in his basement that has a walkout. And then, his home is above that. And I remember walking up the hill, because there was a nice like hiking area above, and the hiking area also was called the Fire Road. And because it was so recent to the fire, I could see the trees were blackened and twisted, and it almost looked like a hellscape or something like out of a movie. And then you walk down towards his house, and you can see which houses survived and which didn't. I think it was 3 houses up from his. I could see all the way through the house to the backyard, and just charred remains. I mean, much of the house was standing, but like it was not a house anymore. It was, an open plot with like some walls. But then you walk down to his house, and it was completely unscathed. I'm sure, he had smoke damage in the air conditioning or heating system and things like that. But minus the smoke damage, the building itself was absolutely perfect. And the reason why is because he had fireproof shingle tiles on his roof. His house was the Portuguese style. So like the entire primary building was built out of cement. And then the office on the basement or first floor was glass and steel. So essentially the entirety of the building was built to commercial standards and was built like a commercial building. So, you can make some pretty amazing looking, beautiful commercial buildings. So if people that have the money just build their houses to the standard of commercial buildings and, use cement, glass, and steel opposed to, wood, plastic, and aluminum, then things won't burn. And his house is the perfect example of that. So whenever I think about what people can do, they can be like Mike Schwartz and, build buildings that are, commercially sound. And, I think the question then kind of goes back to, is that the government's responsibility to set building codes to help, push people to do that? Is this just the homeowner's responsibility that if they want to have nice things and keep those nice things, they need to, build to that desired way? Or is this more of a community thing, right? Where, ultimately towns and communities need to get together, maybe they can use their group purchasing power to reduce the cost of building materials and labor, and help people that are maybe not as fortunate to harden their homes. Because the more, this is like a every single house counts type of situation, the more we can harden each individual home, the better off everyone will be. So I think, are rich people mad? Yes. And hopefully they can funnel that frustration and anger to creating a very resilient LA that will withstand the next 100 years of fires because they've actually built right from the beginning.
There's a balance here. And again, as a guy who hasn't lived in the United States in 30 something years, just the chatter that I hear and the things that I see say that in this kind of political environment, it seems so anti-regulation and so sort of anti-cost that compelling people to do these things, particularly people that have financial challenges, is going to be almost impossible. But so compelling wealthy people to kind of help underprivileged communities to do it, it just feels like it's going to be really hard to solve this. But if I've got a house in Malibu or in Palisades or in Brentwood, I'm going to want to rebuild it, right? And I'm going to. But for someone who has, is in like a tangential neighborhood, they're going to have a real problem. And we're going to have to talk about the insurance impact of this, right? Because this is an insurance podcast. But how do you square that circle, right? Because there's all this noise and storm and dram about like, I don't want to be regulated because it's too expensive. But if my house burns down, wouldn't I have rather spent money on building it up to code like your friend did so that it wouldn't go away? How do you balance that stuff?
Yeah. So I think, there's different ways. Like one is, just suck it up and that's what you got to do. Like this is for the benefit of everyone, sometimes everybody. The government has to enforce basic things to, protect your neighbors. So that's one approach. I'm not necessarily an advocate one way or another. The other approach is like, why don't we go back to where we were 400 years ago, right? Where, if your house burns down, that's on you, right? And hopefully, communities have people that care about each other. And, back then, there was the charity of, the church or the religious institutions, and, people would get together and help rebuild homes. And, we could rely on community to support each other. I think, we live a little bit in the US of a too individualistic and, agnostic society for that to come back. But, the idea of communities supporting each other is definitely, a viable thing, right? If people really don't want their houses to burn down, then they can stop the other ignition points. So, there is some idea that, we're all in it together. But if you want the completely 100%, everyone for themselves free market approach, then just let it be, right? Like if you want to build your house to those standards and other people don't, and it's going to burn down, then just accept personal responsibility, right? The wealth in your house is now much more volatile. Just like, if you were to put your money in, new cryptocurrency, that's basically what people are doing with their house. So I think if you're not ready to accept responsibility, then you are accepting volatility. And I think that's just, the key point here. And, I know we're going to get into the insurance stuff, but, people have this entitlement that like, because my house burned down, that I'm, obligated from somebody else to get my house back. But ultimately, your life is a result of choices. And, a lot of the articles I've been reading is that, there have been people for the last 5 or 6 years have warned about this type of thing, in the same sense that people warn about the next big earthquake is going to happen in, California. So I think, be an informed citizen, learn about the area that you live in, read about the history, read about the environment, and be a curious person. And if you are that, then you'll understand and you can make choices. Like there's nothing that forces someone to live in one specific place, right? Like, yeah, it's great that you have your house, and I might sound like callous or a mean person, but I think this is just radical responsibility, accepting responsibility for the outcome of your decisions over your lifetime, and not looking for someone else to give you a handout. I think if people can move to that, then we'll be in a better spot.
Yep.
And the derivative of that for insurance is like, don't be entitled to think that you have to, or it's a God-given right that you should have insurance, right? Like, insurance is a relatively recent concept that's in its modern form has really only been around since like mid to late 1600s, and ultimately before that we just took what happened to us. So I think we may in some markets be going back to the past, so to speak. But if you do want to accept accountability and responsibility, and you can build back correctly, then that's an opportunity for insurers and insurtechs to ultimately cover people that want to do things right. And there's a lot of great insurtech startups that are essentially saying, hey, we're going to cherry pick the very best homes, the most defensible homes in areas that are at high risk. It's not going to be cheap, but you can still get the coverage. But if you don't do any of those things, then we're not interested in you.
I want to give you an example of building resilience in, right? Because I lived in Japan for 22 years. And Japan sits on one of the largest earthquake fault lines in the world. And to be fair, I survived one of the largest earthquakes in human history from March 2011, the thing that happened in Fukushima and off the coast, right, in Japan. But I may have told you this, but I also built a house in central Tokyo. So I bought some land, built a house, and worked with Erupt, who is one of the best structural engineering companies in the world, to make sure that it not only did it met, but it beat all of the codes. It was very expensive to do, right? But when that earthquake hit, and it was really powerful, even inside of Tokyo, I was at work. I ran down 20 flights of stairs. I rode my bicycle home, and the whole way home, I was just scared that like my house wasn't going to be there when I got home. But there wasn't even a plate that fell off a counter in my house.
That's
because
impressive.
We had built it, because we built it in a way that was so resilient on purpose that it could withstand the biggest earthquake that Japan had ever seen. And while the property and casualty market is there, you're not necessarily entitled to it. And I agree with you. You don't have to live in California. I didn't have to live in central Tokyo.
Right. Yeah,
but
exactly.
I decided, I made a decision, but I made a decision, David, that if I was going to live in central Tokyo and I was going to build a house in central Tokyo, that I was going to build it so that if the biggest earthquake in the world hit, my house was not going to fall down. Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah, no, I mean, I think to sum it up, insurance is a privilege, not a right. And in the same sense, people think about driving as a privilege, not a right. If you're a drunk driver and you get pulled over, they take away that privilege. If you're, a drunk homeowner that can't take care of their property, then, in theory, you shouldn't necessarily have the privilege to have insurance to cover your home.
So talk to me about the status of the property and casualty insurance in California today, just like at a high level, so people can get a better sense. And then what you think the impact of these fires is going to be just on what happened, but also on the overall structure of the market there. Because I think I think this could be really significant. Yeah.
Yeah. So first thing is like California as a economic powerhouse. So, from what I've read, if California was a country instead of a state, it would be, the sixth largest country by GDP. So, it's a large economic region, has, probably the most population of any state in the US. And, we're talking about Southern California, but Northern California is like a pretty impressive place. That's where Silicon Valley is, and, San Francisco and Oakland, and, there's biotech companies. And then, the Central Valley is like, one of the, largest crop producers areas in the world. And then, go above that in Napa Valley, it's the most expensive land for producing wine, in the United States. So there's a lot of things going on in California. It's not really one market. It's multiple different markets by these different metro areas. And there's also a lot of, very rural areas and, places that people go skiing, like Lake Tahoe. So, given that in terms of the insurance market there, the insurance market is a lot of different markets, but if we're talking about, specifically property casualty, homeowners or commercial building market, it is not a healthy market. And there's a few fundamental things that people need to know about the market. First is that the insurance regulatory schemes in California are very much against the insurer. I mean, you could argue it's very much to protect the consumer. It's debatable whether the end results actually protect the consumer, but the intention of the regulation is consumer focused, anti-insure. And what some examples are is there was a study by Parent Knight that basically said, the median time to get new rates approved for California is a year. And this is compared to, there's other states that are in the kind of, we'll call it top quartile, that's like 30 days. So it's very difficult to get new rates approved for admitted insurance. In general, the government of California doesn't make it easy if you want to stop insuring there. They basically can say you have to wait a year to be able to exit, and you can't like non-renew policies. So anytime you're making a commitment, it's like a minimum of a 2-year commitment, and you have to plan for that. There's also pretty high, regulatory hurdles in terms of, minimum surplus capital to run an insurance carrier there. So there's not a tremendous amount of new entrants entering the market. And then you essentially have a market that, is susceptible to one of the worst catastrophes, wildfires. But that's not, the only catastrophe that, threatens California. There's also this concept of the atmospheric river and the potential that, they could get major flooding, which they have at times.
Earthquakes as well, yeah.
Earthquakes as well. So, they have at least 3 major catastrophic perils that could happen, theoretically at any time, and are not, super easy to prepare for or, reinsure for. So ultimately, they have a highly volatile market. They have a great opportunity market because there's a lot of homes, a lot of expensive homes, and, there's a lot of wealthy people that can afford to pay the premiums. But then you have, a regulatory scheme that makes it difficult to do business. So that's kind of the makeup of California. And because of a lot of those factors recently, many of the insurers have been leaving the state because, there was this kind of concept that, hey, you're a 50-state insurer, you write policies in all states. But there's nothing that forces an insurer to be a 50-state insurer. They could be a 49-state insurer and still make, they might actually make a little less revenue, but more profit, or maybe they'll make more revenue because they can double down in the other states. So this has been happening for probably the last 5 or 6 years as insurance companies have been pulling out of the state. So what happens in many states where they don't have a stable insurance market is they create a insurer of last resort. And this is actually very common on the commercial side of things. Almost, more than half the states have an insurer of last resort for workers' comp.
We talked about this in
insurance.
Florida as well, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Florida has citizens insurance for property. So in California, they have what's called the FAIR plan, which is essentially, a state-run insurance product that allows homeowners to get coverage as a last resort. So essentially, you can pretty much always get something on the FAIR plan, but it usually means that, it's probably only going to cover fire risk only, not liability. It's going to have caps, so it might not actually cover the value of your home. And it's not really a very appealing policy for anyone to have. It's kind of just like, if I can't get anything else, I'll get it. The big problem with the FAIR plan is the economic model that it's designed around is punitive to all the other insurers. So basically how it works is they have, surplus to pay claims, they buy reinsurance. And then behind that, if they run out of money and can't acquire enough reinsurance and have claims that exceed the total amount, how they stay solvent is not raising taxes like some other states do, but they actually assess a fee on all the other insurance companies to pay in to make the FAIR plan viable. So they basically punish you for being an insurance company that's solvent and doing well in the state because ultimately, they didn't properly price or design their insurance. So, take it as it will. Maybe when it came out, or the original actuaries that conceived of it, were able to prove that it worked. But the perception by most insurers is that it's not a very friendly type of environment where you could randomly be assessed fees that you can't predict or control, because they're not your policyholders, they're the state's policyholders.
So what's going to be the impact of this thing? Like, I was looking at some numbers for damage, and it's hard to figure out what it is, but let's just say it's not small. Some places were saying 200 billion, some were saying 250, some were saying those numbers were too high, some were saying they were too low. I don't know what the right number is. I don't think anybody does. But a lot of those people have insurance. What's going to happen to the insurance market now? And what's going to happen to claims and all this other stuff that's just like the day-to-day stuff of running an insurer in California that insures property and casualty, right? It's not just homes, because there are businesses that are also gone, yeah?
Yeah, so there's a few things that are going to happen that just, almost happen by virtue of like catastrophic claims. So first thing is going to happen is, all the insurers are going to do what they can to make well on their promise. And, they are going to pay claims. They're going to send out adjusters, and they're going to do the business of insurance. So I think anyone that says in the media or claims insurers are not going to try and do that, they're just frankly dead wrong. Like, insurers exist to pay claims. That's their customer service. They're going to do it. Some will do it better than others. Yeah. And, that will help you decide, who you should work with in the future. And, they have a reputation for doing that. But ultimately, they are going to do their job. I have no doubt about that. Second thing that's going to happen is that, there's going to be a backlog, right? So when you think about it, the insurers do not have enough employees to send every single adjuster they have to every single home. There's more homes than they have adjusters. So typically what happens in TAT type claims is, they basically get independent adjusters that staff up from all around the country. They fly into the state, and they help adjudicate claims. So, there's going to be specialist insurance adjusters that are going to be all over the state trying to estimate the value. So the reason why there's such range of estimates is because some of the properties, one, are still burning, two might still burn in the next week or 2 weeks. Hopefully it gets resolved tomorrow, but I'm just saying, it doesn't end like immediately you snap your fingers, and the adjusters need to get out there and assess the damage, right? So that's, why there's such a big range, because I haven't been there, so it's hard to tell. Second thing is, these adjusters are very expensive, right? Like, if they're going to have to fly from all these different places all over the country, and usually CAT adjusters charge more money than traditional adjusters because it's dangerous work, right? Like, some of these houses, when they're burned, there's, toxic things in the environment, things might still be burning. There's a lot of risks. So it's more expensive, which means ultimately, that means in future years, insurers don't price risk on a random basis. They price risk as a combination of what they believe the actual costs are and a way to keep economically solvent. So they're going to have to raise rates in order to pay for the expenses that they incurred this year so they stay solvent. So that means primary insurance will go up, reinsurance will go up, some areas will be uninsurable, and some people will be expected to complete additional, hardening, loss mitigation, prevention, and other activities that are going to make generally the homes and communities safer and more resilient. So all of those things are absolutely going to happen. I think how quickly that happens is basically going to come down to the construction market in California. How many contractors can they add on a daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly basis over the next 5 years to rebuild California? And frankly, from people that I know in Northern California, the construction environment in California is absolutely terrible. There's not enough contractors.
It's a nightmare.
Getting permits and zoning is extremely difficult. So the best thing that the government can do, hands down, above even, I would say, making the insurance market more solvent, is to do everything they possibly can to bring more contractors into the state, even to the point where, like, some people might say I'm kind of crazy for saying this, but make it easier for immigrants to come to the country to do construction, even if it's like temporary visas.
Good luck with that.
Because California is known for having sanctuary cities. So make sanctuaries for construction workers. Get them to come from wherever in the world. We need more construction workers that are going to fix the homes, rebuild the homes. So if we have more construction workers, if we make zoning rules easier, and if we make permitting rules easier, I'm not saying don't
Rules
have
easier,
any
for sure.
permitting, just make it easier and faster, have mobile permitting units, have more home inspectors, have more of everything, right? If you have more supply of contractors, zoning and
It
permitting
all gets
people,
cheaper, yeah.
and just crush the bureaucracy, right? And hold everyone accountable to the process, set like maximum timelines that, permits can be approved, then we're going to have a California bounce back, in 1 to 2 years, opposed to 5 to 10 years, including, having communities that never recover. So I think, if we don't want a repeat of another, Paradise Fire, that's what we have to do. We have to drive up the supply of construction materials, of contractors, and government officials that can approve new projects.
One more thing before I let you go, David. You've got 2 events coming up as InsurTech New York, right? InsurTech Slopes, which is soon.
Yeah.
In February, early February.
First week of February.
But also
Colorado.
The InsurTech New York 2025, your like flagship thing, the spring conference. Do you think, which is when, in April, if I have this right?
Exactly. April.
Do you think
first week?
So, and you plan these like years, and not years, but you plan them at least a year in advance, right? But this just happened like last week and 2 weeks ago. Do you think that people are going to be talking about this at both of these events? I know that the Slopes thing is slightly smaller than the spring conference, but still, that like InsurTech Slopes it's in Vail, it's out west. People are going to know that this has gone on. Like, what is your anticipation of what these conversations are going to be like? Because you brought up just a bunch of really, I don't want to say controversial, but contentious parts of this conversation, right? Of like, okay, look, let's get the government, particularly in this environment, just make permitting easier. It doesn't have to be like a free for all, but it should be way easier and way faster. Let's make pricing of insurance that don't need approval for 365 days, but maybe 30 days, like the rest of the country. And you can be as angry as you want about immigration, but we need more workers. Where are we going to get them from? Because we can't birth them and make them 25 years old overnight. And I will say this, though, because I have lived not in my home country for over 30 years. So in some sense, I have been a documented immigrant for decades. And the 2 countries where I've resided, Japan and Thailand, are very strict and proudly strict on who does get to come in and doesn't get to come into the country. And I will tell you this too, David, because I don't talk about this a lot, but like if you violate the immigration rules in Thailand, they will put you on a plane and send you somewhere, and they don't care what happens to you when you get there. And Japan, the same thing. I'll tell you a story. I want to get back to the conferences in a second, but like in the early 90s, the Japanese, I wouldn't say imported, but they allowed a bunch of people from Iran to come into the country to do a whole bunch of jobs that Japanese people didn't want to do. And then one day they were just all gone because the government just decided they just didn't want to have more immigrants in the country anymore. And they were just gone. Anyway, talk to me about Slopes in the spring conference and what you think the conversations there are going to be like.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely the conversation at Slopes are going to be about this. And it's interesting, last night we had a founders dinner in New York, and I was talking to, one of the attendees who, has a kind of mutual acquaintance of one of our venture partners who actually runs Kettle, which is a MGA that does, wildfire exposed properties in the state of California. And he's like, I was kind of afraid to call Isaac, he's the CEO of Kettle now, because I wasn't sure if he was okay. And I was like, no, don't worry. Like, I just talked to Isaac 6 hours ago, yeah, things are going to be difficult and he's going to have to pay claims, but, they are doing fine. They did good quality underwriting. They were very picky about what they did. And, this is a testament about how you actually can make money in difficult markets if you do the right things and use technology. So it kind of actually proves the whole InsurTech theory.
That's good, though, right?
It's awesome. So, Isaac told me that, and he's like, look, if people want to call me, yeah, I am busy right now, but I will answer the call and, I'll give you some insights. So, Isaac's not planning to come to Slopes, but, we do have a speaker, Kate Sampson, who is an investor at Anthemis and has, invested in, I think she was an investor in Kettle and also Delos as well. So she's going to definitely be talking about that for sure and have, multiple firsthand experiences. So that's at least one of our speakers, but, not a lot of people know, but, Colorado is also a wildfire exposed area. I was born in Colorado and sadly, the house that I was born in burned down in a wildfire. So, it's something that I can personally relate to, and, coming back to Colorado every time, it does, make me think about that. So I would say the conversation will definitely be about that. I mean, we'll definitely be talking about the other normal topics as well. But, I'm super pumped about that event. Snowboarding is probably my top hobby. So there is still space, if you're thinking about events for the year and you want like an event where you're going to make seriously like new friends at the event and, really have intimate time with other founders and investors. It's not really like any other conference. You're not, going to the place to learn and network. You're really going to have deep conversations, make friends. And, the topics we have are hard hitting, like
about real things though. Yeah.
Real things, like things that you would not talk about a 100 or 1,000 person conference because it's uncomfortable. Like we've had founders come up at previous events and talk about founder breakup. We've had founders talk about, what salaries are acceptable with real examples and real stories. This is not, in the hypothetical. We don't play politically correct there. We talk about what it's really about. So if you want something real, that's a great experience. If you're looking to really track the trends, what's going on for more of a traditional conference, that's, our spring conference. We have both a property and casualty track. We have a life and health track. And, we do our absolute best to do kind of quality control on the content. So every single panel, I write the questions and make sure that they are both, solid questions and, get the best out of the speakers that we have. So, we put a lot of energy and effort into the content, but, the networking's great too. A third of the audience is, the industry, carriers and brokers. And then, another third is InsurTech. So if those are the people you want to meet, you should definitely join us at the spring conference in April.
Awesome. Okay, look, I'm going to tell you this. I'm going to reach out to Isaac on my own. I won't bother you to ask you to do that. This has been amazing. As always, I really appreciate it. I learned a ton. I love the back and forth. We don't necessarily have to agree on everything, but boy, I do love having these conversations with you every month, David. This was awesome. David Gritz, a co-founder and managing director at InsurTech New York, a conversation that had to be had. Thanks, man.
Thanks.